Hello, hello. Hello, do you hear me? Okay, great. Everybody, welcome to our webinar, Cortical Visual Impairment. We're really glad that you could join us today. All of our webinars are recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you are registered, you will receive all of the information. There is a chat box option, and I just put a message into the chat box. It has a link to take a survey for this webinar. If you could do that, we would greatly appreciate it. It also has a link to our CVI portal. We have other webinars coming up. On Wednesday, we have one on gamification and the IEP. We have technology for the vision students. We have a lot of things coming up, so go ahead and check those out. And if during the course of the webinar you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat box, and I will let Rebecca know about any questions. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Rebecca. Thank you so much for doing this, Rebecca.
My pleasure. Thanks everybody for tuning in here. So we're going to continue our discussion about cortical visual impairment, and we're really going to cover things about literacy and pre-literacy and how we can build that in our students with cortical visual impairment, but also how to know where to begin. All right, we can go to the next slide. So the first thing we want to do is we have to determine the phase that our student is in before we can do anything else. And from there, we can determine the educational accommodations and modifications that our students need. So just as a really quick refresher, when we have students who are in phase 1, we're seeing them score on the range of 0 to 3. Oh, sorry, my notes are going haywire there. And our students in phase 1, they require a lot of accommodations, really intentional planning. When we think about our students who are in phase 2, we're thinking about students who have scored a 3+ to 7 on the range, and there we're focusing on integrating their vision and functional tasks. And in phase 3, we're thinking about students who have scored a 7+ to 10 on the range, and for those students, we're working on refining those characteristics. And we don't typically see students with CVI ever resolve all of the characteristics, because there's always a situation where we're going to find that they are going to need some kind of accommodations. After we determine the phase, then we can determine the next steps for how to work with our students with CVI. All right, next slide. Something that goes hand in hand with the CVI range in assessing our students is the communication matrix. And the communication matrix is a research-based assessment tool. It pinpoints current communication levels, and it provides a framework for determining goals. The matrix includes all types of communication, including alternative forms such as picture symbols, electronic devices, voice output systems, Braille, sign language, and 3D symbols, and pre-symbolic communications such as gestures and body movements, sound, eye gaze, and facial expressions, as well as typical communication, which is speech. And it covers 7 levels of development in the early stages of communication. And so how are the communication matrix and the CVI range related? They are both key tools in determining how our students can gain access to their educational materials and environment. All right, next slide. Perfect. So here is what the communication matrix looks like. And I'm guessing that a lot of us have seen it, and probably some of us have not. And so typically the SLP is the one who fills out the communication matrix, and it's helpful when we work together with the SLPs to do this. But even if we find that the students doesn't have an SLP, or if they haven't done the communication matrix, you can kind of walk through it and get a general idea of where our students are. When we think about level 1 of the communication matrix, we're looking at pre-intentional behavior. And in level 1, our students, the behavior is not under their own individual control, but it reflects their general state, such as being comfortable or happy or unhappy or hungry. And the caregivers interpret the student's state from behaviors such as body movement, facial expressions, and sounds. And typically developing kids are usually about 0 to 3 months in this pre-intentional behavior at level 1 of the communication matrix. And we're going to progress through this. I'm going to try and make this a really quick review, a preview, or introduction to the communication matrix, because it really does help us pinpoint how to introduce objects and pictures and abstract information to our students. So let's move up. Let's look really quickly at level 2, and that's intentional behavior. And the behavior, again, is under the individual's control, but it's not yet used for communicating intentionally. And so the caregivers are still interpreting this child's needs from behaviors such as body movement and facial expressions, vocalizations, and eye gaze. And our typically developing kids are about 3 to 8 months in level 2. In level 3, we're thinking about unconventional communication, and that's a pre-symbolic behaviors, and they're used intentionally to communicate. And we think about them being pre-symbolic because they do not have any type or sort of symbol that they're using to represent that. They're unconventional because they're not socially acceptable as this child gets older. And so this level, we can think about their behaviors being body movements and vocalizations and facial expressions, but also some simple gestures such as tugging on the caregiver's arm or moving the person to the object that they want. When we think about level 4, we're thinking about a conventional communication. And it's still pre-symbolic, and we're still using intentional communication. But these behaviors are considered to be socially appropriate as the child gets older. And that could be communication such as nodding your head, yes or no, or turning toward or moving away from somebody, waving and hugging, and looking at the person, at the teacher, at the caregiver, at the parent, looking at them, and then looking at the object that they desire. And some vocalizations can be used on this level, on level 4. And usually we have typically developing children about 12 to 18 months on level 4. When we get to level 5, we're thinking about symbols representing or standing for something else. So we're now beginning to really see where we can use these concrete symbols to represent something else. So if we just take one step back for a second and think about our students needing to be at a level 5 before we really introduce the symbol calendar, the calendars and the schedules, we will use these concrete symbols. And so we can extrapolate, right? We can put all this together and really see that we need to really know where our students are so that we know when we can introduce our communication symbols that support the CVI range, so that when we're doing it to set our kids up for success. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't introduce symbols and objects as representation earlier, because that's what we do as teachers, right? But we want to understand that until they reach this level on the communication matrix, they're not really ready to understand the concept that this object is representing an action or a movement or a location. And then when we think about level 6, we're now starting to think about abstract symbols. And symbols represent or stand, these symbols are going to stand for or represent something else. And it could be abstract symbols, braille or print words, things like that that we use to communicate, photographs. And these symbols are abstract because they are not physically similar to what they represent. So when we think about the concrete symbols in level 5, we're actually using a symbol that looks like what it's representing. When we get up to level 6, we're thinking about the abstract symbols. So perhaps the board maker symbols, or like I said, like the print symbols. And then in level 7, we're using combined symbols. We're using abstract and concrete. We're using print, we're using 2D, we're using 3D, and we're putting these all together to make a language. And I'm rattling on, so if there are any questions, please let me know. All right, we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So let's put this all together for literacy. We know that literacy is learned through a hierarchical scale, you know what I'm saying, of skills. Both the communication matrix and the CVI interventions begin with real objects, and symbols are our foundation for literacy. So we're going to start with the object symbols, with the real symbols, and then we can move to a more abstract symbol. And we're thinking about real symbols. We're really thinking about the paintbrush that we're going to use to, excuse me, represent art. We're going to think about the bells that we're going to use for music, or the toothbrush that we're going to use for hygiene. All of those actual objects representing something for our students with CVI. And we want to make sure when we're choosing these objects that we're choosing the objects that fit their phase on the CVI range. And then after the real objects, then we can kind of move into a more abstract object. And so there we're thinking about something to represent the school bus. So perhaps we're taking a seatbelt, or some kind of a clasp that we're going to use to represent getting on the bus or getting in the car. After we know that our students have moved through the communication matrix and moved up to level 6, when we see that our students with CVI are reaching the top of phase 2, then we can start thinking about photographs. And the photographs really need to be real photographs of the actual object. And it really takes intentional planning to move from object symbols to photograph representations. After photos, we're going to move to print and braille, and then finally abstract drawings. All right, and we can move on to the next slide. So when we have object representations, we want to teach our student that this object is representing the concept, is representing a concept or an action or a location. And so objects and object representations are the foundations of literacy. We can use calendar schedules and story boxes. We can use them for building concepts. And we want to use real life manipulatives. We need to intentionally select objects for calendars and schedules and story boxes, because we all know that our students with visual impairment do not have the luxury of incidental learning. So everything we introduce, teach, or reinforce, we must do that with intentionality. So when we think about objects, we want to really introduce these objects in a systematic way. We want to present the symbol in isolation. And we want to present it on a simple background, and we want to present it in the student's preferred visual field and allow extended time for the student to look. And then we ask the student to look, and we are quiet. We present it, and then we're quiet. And the second thing we want to do is we want to place the symbol on the student's tray. And we want to encourage them to touch it, to explore it, and to feel it. to really get to know it. And then from there, we give the auditory feedback about the symbol. We really want to give the salient features of that symbol. We want to talk about what it is and what it does and what it represents. We want to talk about all the salient features of that. I'm sorry, my notes are going crazy here. I'm going to talk about all the salient features that that symbol represents. And then the fourth thing that we want to do is present it again in isolation. So we bring it back into their visual field, and we give them a chance to look at it quietly. And it is a repeat of step one, right? We're doing exactly the same thing. We're showing it to them again in their best field on a non-complex background, so that they can now use their vision again to look at it. And then the next thing we want to do is complete the activity or the location or the place that we're going. We want to connect that symbol, that representation, to the actual experience. And we do this for for our students who are in phase 1 and phase 2. All right, next slide. Perfect. And so let's think about how we're going to move that. Oops, that was on there, thanks. Moving from good to great. So we want to consider a consistent plan for developing the concepts and for the places and activities represented by the symbols. I'll find my place on here. So maybe we want, to be consistent, perhaps we want to write a script on the back of the symbol. So if we have the bells, and they're going to represent music, and we have them presented on the black, thick poster board, the foam board. On the back of that symbol, on the back of that board, we can write the script. We can write what the salient features of that bell are and the location, so that every person who picks up that symbol can say exactly the same thing in exactly the same way, so that we're being consistent. We want to talk about, we all want to be consistent in the way that we're using our language, in the way that we're identifying the salient features. We want to be consistent in the way that we use symbols, in the symbols that we select. So we want to use the same paintbrush and the ball and the same ball and the same spoon and the same pool noodle, etc. They all need to be the same. We don't want to give our student on Monday a yellow ball for representing PE, and then on Tuesday give them the red ball. We want to make sure that we're consistent in the way that we do that. We want to have matching sets of symbols for when we're traveling to locations. So we want the student to see that we're giving them this yellow ball to represent gym, to represent the gym, and when we get there, we want to have that same ball posted outside, so that we can show them when we get there, here's the ball, here's what we're talking about, we're going to PE, and then show them the same ball when we get there, and use that comparative language and talk again about all the things and how they're the same and how it's representing that location or that activity. We want to keep the symbol near the student, just so that they have it and they know that this is what we're doing right this moment. We're connecting this symbol to the experience. And when we're finished, we want to come back and put that activity, we want to put that symbol in a place that represents that we're finished, that we've completed that activity. And in the future, then, we can use that as a way for sequencing and reviewing the day, and for determining what came next and what have we already done. And so as our students begin to move up the CVI range and really demonstrate that they understand that these objects are a representation, we can introduce more than one symbol at a time. So we can have our PE ball that we're going to PE, but when we come back, we're going to lunch. So perhaps as our students are moving through the range, we are moving from one symbol to another as a way to sequence our day. All right, next slide. Great. So for photographs, when we move from objects to photographs, we want to make sure that we don't really begin asking our students to understand that now we're using this two-dimensional photograph to represent something until they're above a 6 on the CVI range. So we really need our students to be solidly at the top of phase 2 before we think about introducing the photographs. And again, we want to introduce photographs intentionally. We want to make sure that the same system that we use with the objects, we want to use again with the photographs. We need intentionality. We need to talk about salient features. And when we begin to move from objects to photographs, we're going to be very selective. And we're going to choose the objects that they already have in their repertoire, and we're going to take actual photographs of those objects. And then we're going to start pairing the object and the photograph. And we're going to talk about the salient features. So we would bring in the yellow ball that we use for PE and have that symbol. And then we would have the photograph of that symbol. And the photograph is going to be just the ball. And so it's going to be, we're going to make sure that we cut that ball out. We're going to take a photo. We're going to go to the CVS, right, and print these out. And we're going to have these photographs. We're going to cut it out. We're going to put it on a black background. And we're going to give it to the student, and we're going to compare that. We're going to use our comparative language and our descriptive language to really talk about how these two things represent PE, how this ball in 3 dimension is now represented by, the ball is now representing the same thing in 2 dimension. And so we point out the shape and the color and everything that makes this ball, the ball that we've used so far, how we can still see that in this photograph. And we begin with the students, like I said, the symbols that they already know, and we build a solid concept using those, and then we can expand. And until our student is really higher, probably into phase 3, we're always going to use the symbol, the actual 3-dimensional symbol first, and then we're going to introduce the photograph. All right, next slide. Written words. So written words, we're thinking about literacy, right? So we're thinking about how our students with CVI are going to be readers. And of course they are. Many of them are. But typical literacy for students with CVI doesn't really occur until they're near a 10 on the CVI range. Not to say that we don't introduce words sooner, but we really have to understand that they're not going to be typical literacy readers until they've resolved almost all of their characteristics. When we introduce the written word, we're going to make sure that we use that wonderful bubble highlighting, that we're going to make sure we outline the critical features that talk about what makes a P and a D, how they both are similar because they have the straight line, and they both have a ball, but the directionality of that straight line is different. So again, we're going to just talk about all the salient features of those letters. We're going to use our comparative language and really make sure that we're talking about how they're the same and how they're different. And of course, we want to make sure that we reduce anything that doesn't belong on the page, comes off when we're asking our students with CVI to read. All right, next page, next slide. So, abstract pictures. Our students have to be in phase 3 to really understand, to generalize and to understand what abstract pictures represent. And they need to be on level 6 of the communication matrix. And so let's let's think about that for a second, because what's the first thing we give our students with CVI who don't talk and who don't have a formal level of communication? We load them up with board maker pictures. And usually those are our students who are in phase 1, high phase 1 and phase 2. We're giving them these board maker pictures that are well beyond their ability to really understand. They don't support their vision, and they don't support the communication. So we're asking our students to use these symbols as a way to represent, but they're unable to. So we're not allowing them to be successful from the very beginning. And abstract is really your board maker pictures and your line drawings, your black and white outlines. An object to photo, so we move object to photo to abstract drawing. And I know that core vocabulary is what's happening in the schools. I know that as a communication piece, we're asking our students to look at the words go and more and use those abstract pictures for communication. And sometimes our students are successful, but it's not usually because they understand that this arrow pointing to the right means I'm going to go. They understand that this green thing, that sometimes when they give it to me on the switch and they put it on my tray and I press it and it says go, that's what it's representing. That it's not representing the concept and it's not representing the action. It's just representing this thing that really has no meaning. So we want to be very careful about abstract pictures. All right, next slide. So here are wonderful board maker pictures. And anybody that knows me knows that I am not a fan of these abstract pictures for our students with CVI. I find them to be so complex and abstract that if the words weren't there a lot of the times, I wouldn't know what they meant. So to gain meaning from abstract pictures, we know that our students need to be a 10 or a 10 plus, more than 10 on the CVI range. They need to be a solid 9, 10, and they need to be moving into that CVI extension. We know to gain meaning from communicative intent, students need to be on level 6 of the communication matrix. And so we really want to consider, does the student generalize the pictures or are they relying on placement and color? And something else I want to challenge us to think about is what's more abstract? Is the word go, G-O, more abstract than, I'm looking for the go here, than the go that's in the middle with the word and then the word again and then the circle on the green arrow? So what really is more abstract? If we're going to teach an abstract idea, it's my own personal belief that we might as well teach the word G-O, go, because that's going to be more consistent throughout the student's life. All right, next slide. So when we're thinking about the application, how to put all these things together, we want to think about the purpose of the activity. So let's go back to using our symbols for literacy. So we have a literacy group and we're going to teach literacy. We're going to use our symbol that represents literacy, whether it's a small book or whatever symbol you've chosen to represent literacy. And we're going to consider the purpose of the activity. So we've told our student it's time for literacy, here's your symbol. We've gone through the process of introducing the symbol and moving through the steps of using the symbol purposefully. Next, we're going to think about the purpose of the activity. And so we need to consider the modifications and the adaptations and the purpose of the activity at hand. All right, so if we go back to the concept of literacy, if we think about our middle school student who is a high phase 2 CVI, and he's going into his LA class, and he is expected to complete a modified activity. And so the activity that day is reading a chapter out of Huckleberry Finn. So the purpose of that activity is concept, right? Is reading this chapter. But for our student with CVI, the best way to gain that, his learning media, is probably not going to be reading those words on the page, or even having that book presented to him. The purpose of that is content. So what we want to do is we want to give it to him auditorily if that's his preferred mode. So through Bookshare for Human Reader, we would read this passage to him so that he was getting the content of his peers. But then we would take the vocabulary words that he needed from that activity and present them in a way that supported his CVI. So we're still asking him to complete the same activity, but we're modifying it for him in a way that makes sense. So giving him the content auditorily and then giving him the vocabulary words in a way that's purposeful for him. And so that might be foam letters on a page if that's what he needs. It might be presenting those vocabulary words on an iPad that we've used the bubble technique to outline the words for him. It might be magnetic letters, whatever we have identified as his means for visually accessing those vocabulary words. That's how we're going to introduce that section. And one of the best things we can do is to really intentionally instruct and provide for our students with CVI is use the routine planning form. And that there's a copy of that in Christine's book. And so you're just going to task analyze the activity. And again, we're going to look at the purpose, and then we're going to look at the best means for accomplishing that. And then for anything that we're using visual, like learning the vocabulary words, we're going to make a list of all the accommodations and supports that we need for that activity. After we've done that, we want to make sure that we pre-teach before that should have been first even, right? We want to pre-teach what we're asking that student to use for his vision. So we want to make sure that we're laying a foundation for the concept, for the activity, for the visual input. We want to introduce the materials and the objects and the words being used in the lesson before we ask them to use it for gaining detail and meaning, for gaining concepts. We need our students to be able to go into that class, go into that LA class and be ready to learn. We need our students to learn for learning, not learning to keep up. So we want them to go in with all of that visual information preloaded so that when they're reviewing their vocabulary words, it's not the first time they're seeing them. We want to make sure that we're pre-teaching those. And then we want to follow up. We want to review to make sure that the student really understood the concept of what we were teaching them. All right, next slide. Oh, look at that. I was way early. So that's me. I'm Becky, and thank you for hanging out with me this afternoon, and please let me know if you have questions. And the next slide gives the references that we used today. There you go.
Awesome. Thank you, Becky, so much for doing this webinar for us. If participants, if you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat box, or I will also be sending out an email probably tomorrow with the webinar and the slideshow, so you can also email Becky if you have any questions later on. Do not forget to take our survey about the webinar so you can let us know your thoughts. We would love to hear from you. If you have other ideas for other webinars, we would love to hear that as well.
All right, thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Becky.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.